Welcome and thank you for joining us for Two Steps Forward, our daily Bible study. I'm James and this is Aid, and we are up to episode number 232, 2 Samuel chapter 6. The book of 2 Samuel, just as a reminder, is the life of King David. So 1 Samuel was the prophet Samuel, the Israelites' issues with the Ark of the Covenant, the anointing of Saul to be the first king in Israel, how that all kind of fell apart, but God is going to reconcile the kingdom and restore it and broaden it through King David. It's not all perfect, but a lot of it, especially in the early days, goes well. So we're at 2 Samuel 6, and some things are coming full circle as the Ark of the Covenant is being restored to Jerusalem. Anything you want to say, Aid, before we get started here? All right, so make sure to read through your copy of 2 Samuel 6 at home. Here is my summary. David gathered the able-bodied young men of Israel. The number given to us here is about 30,000 total. David and some of his men went to Bala in Judah to the house of Abinadab to get the Ark of the Covenant. Two sons of Abinadab, named Uzzah and Ahio, helped guide the cart on which the ark was transported. David and the people were dancing and celebrating the return of God's presence to Jerusalem. At one point, the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah, one of the guys guiding the cart, reached out and he took hold of the ark to stabilize it. And God was so angered by this irreverent act that we're told he strikes Uzzah down. David was angry that the Lord's wrath fell on Uzzah. He doesn't understand it. David was, and it's hard for us to understand. We'll try to unpack it in a second. But David was then afraid of the Lord, and he asked how they would ever be able to survive having the ark in Jerusalem if they can't even transport it without somebody getting killed. David took the ark then to the house of Obed-Edom, and the ark remained there for 3 months, and the Lord blessed the family there tremendously. When David heard that everything went well at Obed-Edom's house, he returned to get the ark. They sacrificed a bull and fattened calf and danced before the Lord with music to please the Lord. Michal, David's wife, one of David's wives, from her window, she saw David dancing like crazy. And she despised him for this, we're told, seeing it as silly and, again, irreverent. They took the ark to a tent in Jerusalem, and David sacrificed offerings to God and blessed the people in the Lord's name. He gave food to all the people in attendance, knowing that this was a celebratory occasion. When David got home, Michal went out to meet him, and she explained how embarrassed she was due to David's behavior. She specifically says something, depending on your translation, something like going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would do. David said that his dancing and celebration was for the Lord, and in the end, this would make him more honored in the people's eyes, not less. We're then told that Michal, who was Saul's daughter, remember, and his first wife, she had no children moving forward. Whether this was punishment from the Lord or just coldness from David, we don't know, and we'll discuss, but that's the summary to 2 Samuel 6. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I feel like we have talked about this before because I remember saying I didn't like it when you mowed the lawn without a shirt on. And I was like, I feel what she's saying. Like all the
dancing around
ladies.
In the servant girls, yeah. Like any vulgar fellow. Yeah, I'm sure we've probably talked about it before. This section contains two really kind of provocative. The killing of Uzzah and Michal's interaction with David here are both. For being relatively unknown incidents, there's a lot of ink that's been spilled on them over the years. So we probably have talked about it a little bit. It's probably worth revisiting. But here we go. Devotional thought number 1: restoring the ark to Israel. So just so we have a time frame here, for the past 75 years, the ark has not been in Israel. It was absent from, remember, the tabernacle is in Shiloh. It was stolen in war, if you remember, at the time of Eli, the prophet. Eli and his sons, they had taken it out to battle, almost using it as like a good luck charm. Eli's the priest in Israel. The Philistines took it as they defeated the Israelites. They recognized it had power in it, but that power was actually like a curse to them. It was causing tumors and stuff in the cities of the Philistines. So they got rid of it. They put it on a cart, and it was sent back to Israel. Then it went to a town in Israel called Beth Shemesh. 70 young guys who were there looked inside the ark, and they were killed for looking inside the ark. And at that point, it's sent to a neighboring town called Kiriath Jearim, where it was guarded at the house of Aminadab, which is where we find it here. Moving forward, there seems to be a time in which essentially you have like two high priests, one functioning at the tabernacle in Shiloh, one functioning in Jerusalem. The guys that are named specifically are Zadok and Ahimelech. I think the question here, so this is the big return of the Ark of the Covenant after 75 years to now the capital city of the Israelites, Jerusalem. The Ark is more than just a piece of artwork. It's not like a painting where it's just like some, artwork that we're admiring.
I don't even really know what it is. So it's where God used to live, but now he doesn't live there anymore.
Well, it's like, so the top of it is called the mercy seat, and that's the place where God's physical manifested presence on earth could be pinpointed. So like God in a sense is everywhere. He has jurisdiction over everything. But if you say, well, where is he? The Israelites would have thought.
He'd be sitting on that seat.
That's his throne. Yep.
Okay.
The Ark of the Covenant where they placed sprinkled blood of the lamb that covers over the broken commandments. Yep.
But was God ever actually there?
Yeah, so he was, in fact, there's, someday we'll get to the dedication of the temple, and we're actually told that a visible presence of the Lord comes down at the temple. And so, like, there were times, so this is the same, when we talk about the presence of God, it's like the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness. Remember, there's the pillar of the cloud and fire? That's the visible presence.
So did anyone, okay.
And on top of Sinai would be another incident.
So did anyone see him sitting there?
Not sitting per se, it just means his presence was there.
Okay.
Yes. And they didn't see it because they didn't go in there to look. It came, like the high priest went in there once a year.
Okay. Gotcha.
And if people did things inappropriately, they would like try to go see it. They would either go blind or get killed.
Okay.
This is why.
So now that God's gone from it, you can look at it, you just can't touch it.
Right. So the whole concept here, and we'll get to this with our next point, but the whole concept here is that the Israelites have like, it's good to have the presence of the ark, but when you use the ark the wrong way or perceive it the wrong way, it's actually hurtful to you, not helpful. It's kind of like how I would consider religion. So like earthly religion, man-made religion is not like, is Christianity a religion? Well, yes, but one that's helpful for us. Religion that's man-made actually becomes hurtful for mankind. Right? So it's kind of like that. The Israelites are distorting their perception of God and their perception of how they interact with God. I think the application question I want to ask here is, okay, so this is specifically, it's a piece of art that is fashioned by a skilled artisan, commissioned by God at the exact specifications that God gave. And he promises his presence there. Do you think people look at things like, we've talked about this a little bit before too, but Christian artwork today, or artwork in general, or monuments, or, like, so for instance, Holy Land pilgrimages, we've talked about, people wanting to go to, touch Peter's bones or something like that. Or just like Christian artwork in general. What do you think is an unhealthy relationship with that versus a healthy relationship?
Oh, that's your question.
Yeah. Like, so
Let me ask you a better question.
Okay.
What I perceive as a better question.
Okay.
Is it wrong to, do you think that, okay, so Solomon spends all this money, or David's money, whatever, on building the temple.
Yeah.
In a little while.
Yeah, David raises the funds for it, Solomon ends up building it.
So once Jesus came and he said, this temple is not where God lives anymore. Like, God lives in you, like my people are the temple. So do you think it's wrong now in this new covenant to spend like inordinate amounts of money building a church? Yeah.
So, no, yeah, as in I'm affirming the question, not necessarily saying I agree. So, but that is kind of where I was going, or trying to go with my question too. Is to what extent there would be, so like during the Reformation there was a group called the Iconoclasts that basically said, not because of financial reasons, but I can see how they would come to that after the cathedrals were built in the Middle Ages. I could see how they could come to that conclusion. It was more because they thought it was a violation of the commandments, not making any graven images kind of things to God. But I think the general idea that we invest in people, not things, we invest in ministry, not artifacts, is the right posture of the New Testament covenant. In a way that's different than the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God at times, so we'll talk about this a little bit too. God never initially commanded this temple to be built. He did command a tabernacle, but the temple is like David's idea. He's basically living in a palace, and he's like, well, it's not right that I would live in this, but God is out there in a tent. So like I need to build a better...
It's a funny thought.
Well, so like it's how the human brain works though. Like, okay, I have this great thing, but God, if I'm going to honor God, you should have something even greater. And God's like, I didn't ask for that. I was perfectly content. If you guys would just worship me at the tabernacle, I'm perfectly content with it.
Is that the tent?
Yeah, the tabernacle is the tent that God is. It's a temporary dwelling that the Israelites carried through the wilderness. And the whole concept of it being a tent is that there's not a permanence attached to it. Like, you are strangers in this world. Heaven is your home. The real promised land is the ultimate promised land.
Yeah.
And so, like, the whole concept about temple building was not so much God's idea. God allowed it in the same way that he allowed, like, a king in Israel. But that wasn't really God's idea either. God was like, And so when you get to the New Testament, what Jesus has sort of done is he's unraveled some of the things that were allowed in the Old Testament for God's people. And he said, like, no, you need to move away from that. And so the idea of constructing... It doesn't matter today. Church buildings that house 30,000 people, or cathedrals in the Middle Ages, or smaller buildings, but it's primarily about the art. It's like the people that really push for that, I tend to think, are just wired heavily towards fine art. And I'm not against fine art. There is a semblance in which you can stand in a cathedral and get a measure of the awesomeness of God. I think you can get something similar at the Grand Canyon, and it costs a lot less. You know, so and therefore, like, very clearly, I don't know that it could be any clearer that in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says, we do not live in temples. God does not live in temples made by human hands. He lives in his body, the church. And so I think, without crossing the line of saying, like, it's wrong to spend this much on a building, it's wrong to spend this much on artwork, it's wrong to spend, without crossing that line, I think it's safe to say, and most importantly, scripturally supported to say, that God's people invest more in God's people to glorify God than we do in things to glorify God. You same page?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying the question. Devotional thought number 2. Right aim, wrong methodology. So this is the part with Uzzah getting killed. And this is lots of questions about this. And people actually even get a little angry. And I think, honestly, modern people look at this and say, like, yeah, this is the stuff about God in the Old Testament that I don't like.
Yeah.
You know, like, this seems petty and spiteful or whatever. It makes it sound like he has just an ego or something like that. And he's just going to, you know... Is that really what's going on here? Essentially, what had happened, remember, God had already given the Israelites instructions on when you build the ark, here's how you transport the ark. Here's exactly how it's supposed to be done. It's that stuff that you generally skip over when you read the Bible. All that stuff in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. So Numbers 4 gives you very careful instructions about why it's made the way it is, how it's supposed to be carried on poles on guys' shoulders, transported that way. It's supposed to be transported by Levites, the priestly tribe, who descend from from a guy named Kohath, and it's supposed to be carried on their shoulders. At this point, what the Israelites are doing, you notice they're carrying it on a cart that is pulled by oxen. The interesting thing
Well,
is...
that's just new technology.
Well, that's exactly... Do you remember who else was doing that?
The Philistines.
The Philistines. In other words, they're trying to glorify God, but they're doing it the exact same methodology, the exact same way that the Philistines were doing it. It's not the pattern that God had given to them. And actually, so the point here is that God's work has to be done God's way. Otherwise, it's an issue of, like, pride. If you tell God, I'm going to worship you the way I want to worship you, it's still about you, right? When that's actually counterintuitive to the whole idea of worship. So when Uzzah is killed for grabbing hold of the ark to steady it, we have no evidence that Uzzah and Ahio are, number one, even qualified to transport the ark. And very clearly, the way Tim Keller puts this, I think in one of his sermons, is that he must have thought that his hands, so preventing the ark from falling to the ground, to the dirt, he must have thought that his hands were less dirty than the dirt of the earth. In other words, he doesn't recognize his own contamination, that he's not meant to actually touch the ark. And, I think very clearly this all betrays kind of the issue of pride in Israel. Like, even when you have the right intentions, even when David is saying, I want to glorify God, I want to worship God, I want to restore the ark to Israel, David's still kind of full of himself because he's going to do it his own way.
Yeah.
And he's constantly telling God what he's going to do.
Well, I feel like this was more David's fault than anyone's fault, which is why I think he gets so upset about it. The fact that the guy was killed.
Yeah, I think he probably feels responsible.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
I think he is responsible. So I don't think that the guy was thinking like, well, my hands are cleaner.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure
No,
it was just
not
like
consciously.
right. It was just like a reflex, but it all goes back to, like you shouldn't be doing this in the first place. So there's going to be some consequence.
The intent is not everything. Intent is important, but it's not everything. And doing things like, so being a worshiper of God, again, it's not about how you want to worship God. It's like when we talk about things like love languages, we say it's not enough to love somebody. To truly love somebody, you don't love them the way that feels natural for you to love them. You love them the way that they need to be loved, right? Same thing here. If you actually worship God, you don't worship how you choose. It's not about you. It's about him.
It's also an important lesson for David to learn that if you're going to make decisions for your organization, like the people that you're leading are going to suffer the consequences if you're not making God-pleasing decisions.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you're right. I hadn't really thought about him feeling the responsibility attached to this, but I'm sure that probably is the case. We actually, interestingly, see this a couple different times in the Bible, that in new periods for God's people, God sometimes manifests his power in ways that seem almost like they seem like a lot. And we would almost say excessive. Clearly they're not if it's from God, but he's clearly establishing an example. So it's very similar here. They're starting a new period in Israel where we're going to worship in Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant is going to be there. And God is saying, I need you to stop messing around trying to do things your own way. You're not even studying my word. You haven't made any sacrifices to me. You haven't asked my input on this. You haven't read from Deuteronomy to see how you're supposed to transport this. You've got to be much more careful. God does something very similar in the New Testament church in Acts 6 with Ananias and Sapphira. Remember, they give an offering, but it's not like they lie about it a little bit or they embellish, and God strikes them dead. And same thing. People are like, doesn't that seem a little excessive? He's like, no. When I'm starting out the church, I need to set the foundation in a way that says, like, we're not going to lie here. You need to be honest and transparent about stuff. Well, same thing here. Do we want to worship God how we want to worship God, or are we going to actually submit to God's will and God's law? That's the deal. And is Uzzah kind of an example that God sets? Yeah, but also understand God knows what's in his heart, and he knows there's probably some pride there too. So, Do you think most modern people would say it's unnecessarily harsh, or do you think it's unnecessarily harsh?
I think it is what it is.
Okay, so you know enough. I think it's one of those things
Yes, I think most people would be like, that sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's unnecessary.
If you're a Christian, you know enough to say, okay, I probably shouldn't be judging what God is doing here, but my instincts feel like that's excessive. But it's kind of like child-parent thing. I remember my dad. So my dad was a teacher. I remember him explaining to me every year, because one year I saw him kind of go off on a kid for doing something. The kid was doing something wrong, but it was very, like, he didn't raise his voice a ton, but like in school, he definitely did. And everybody was kind of like pins and needles after that. And I remember saying something to him about it afterwards that day. And he said, honestly, he knew what he was doing was wrong. And early on in the year, I usually find one incident where somebody who knows they're doing something wrong, I make a public example of it. Because everybody needs to know in this room that when you openly defy what the authority has already said, there's going to be consequences attached to it. Whether or not we deem that as fair, I think authorities have the right to do that in their families, and God certainly in his church. Yeah. Okay, third devotional thought. David dances and Michael, I don't have the second half of what I wrote down there, but David dances and Michael criticizes is probably what I wanted to say. This is super interesting to me too. So the Uzzah incident is over. The ark is taken to the household of this guy named Obed-Edom. It's there 3 months, and David sees that this guy's household is actually getting tremendously blessed by the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. And so David says, okay, clearly there's not anything wrong with the Ark of the Covenant or having it. We must have just been doing something wrong. So he goes back. This time he consults God. This time he makes like a bull sacrifice. This time he's submitting to God's word, and it's like, I'm not only going to do it, I'm going to do it God's way. Mm-hmm. God is pleased with that. In all of this, David's probably got some pent-up emotion about everything that's happened, but like, so the ark is starting to come back, and we're told that David dances furiously and joyfully in worship to God. Mm-hmm. Now, that's transported properly. It's whatever. There's dancing in the ancient religious world for celebrations. Usually it was done by women, not men. Both pagans and God's people sometimes dance and stuff like this. But the kicker here is not that he's dancing, which in and of itself seems to prove that God wouldn't be against this, because the Bible doesn't critique David here. The one who critiques him is Michal. Michal, his first wife, looks out her window, sees David dancing. That whole comment about it being half naked is a little bit weird because I don't think he's exposing himself inappropriately here. So if you read 1 Chronicles 15 on this, it actually says that he's wearing something underneath. So it's not like private areas are being exposed kind of thing, right? She just doesn't like it how he's looking like a common laborer and a common, that kind of thing. If you look at the history of dancing, so like you have it here in the early Christian church, and shortly afterwards, a lot of the church fathers, they didn't know exactly what to think of it because there was so much pagan ritualistic dancing that they thought, should we be practicing something like this? And so by several centuries AD, most concepts of dancing seem to be mostly eliminated from the Christian church. Again, not from a biblical mandate, but the perception of associating with pagan religion and for the, I suppose, temptation of like immorality or something like that. But the point here is the Bible does not criticize David for dancing like this. Michal criticizes David for dancing like this. In fact, in the whole thing, she's kind of impersonal. She doesn't call him the king. She doesn't call him David. She calls him the king. You know, like she's not even like relating to him. She's snarky. She's condescending. She's overly concerned about public appearances, which, if you remember, that's exactly what her father, Saul, was concerned about, and was his legacy. The result of this seems to be that David and she no longer have any kids any further. And some Bible commentators will say, yeah, like maybe the Lord closed her womb, and she just, this is punishment for unfairly and publicly criticizing her husband. Other Bible commentators will say, like, David is really upset with her, and he's just not interested in her anymore after being disrespectful like this, and he just doesn't have relations with her anymore.
I mean, okay, so she's embarrassed. I honestly just think she hated him at this point. Like
because of the other wives?
He's left her once before. No, that he pulled her away from a seemingly loving husband against her will. Like, I think she's just over him.
So you're sympathetic to Michal in this?
I mean...
Yeah, this is good for me to hear because it's like I'm seeing it from one angle, but...
Yeah, I think she just resented everything about him.
So you think he was unrespectable and therefore...
To her. I'm not saying what he was doing was unrespectable.
But she's now got this filter on her life that she sees him, everything that he does is...
Yes.
She's critical of.
Yes.
Yeah.
He left her. She got a new husband. He came back, was arrogant enough to take her back from her husband.
Yeah. So the he left her part, I don't know exactly where I would fall on that in terms of, he's running for his life.
Okay.
You know. But yeah, that he could have come back and tried to get her sooner.
Or taken her with him. I don't know.
Taken her with, didn't have to take another wife.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that fall in there that you can see, like, yeah, I could see how Michal wouldn't like this. And then takes him away from a guy that she is with.
So, okay, now I'm married to the king, but he's acting like an idiot.
From her perspective.
Yes, from her perspective.
Yeah, the question is...
Like, I can't win here.
I think part of the question is he actually acting like an idiot?
No, I don't think he is, obviously. Right?
Right. So again,
I mean, I don't know what his state of undress was like, but
right. There's some questions about his decency here, but we just said a minute ago, intent is not everything, but clearly at this point, his intent, he seems to be humbled and his intent seems to be good. He also seems to genuinely be seeking to worship the Lord. I think it's worth noting that the Bible writers themselves don't seem to record it in such a way that they're criticizing him.
Yeah.
The critique very clearly here from a tone standpoint, seems to fall on Michael. But the question of, it's like when somebody is guilty of a crime, but they themselves were they were a victim. It's like it never justifies the crime, but it helps you understand it a little bit better.
Yeah.
So she probably has some reasons for being upset. She doesn't have good reason for being this critical of David in this way.
I'm curious what you think about his behavior.
Specifically the dancing, or the state of dress,
dancing.
or
the dancing.
I think too many arguments have been used trying to either. So like we've talked at our church, for instance, we have a praise dance team, and we in general, I think our worship tries to be a little bit more expressive than a lot of us grew up with, which is very Germanic culturally, but we don't live in mid-20th century Germany anymore. So trying to be a little bit more, the Western world is a little bit more emotionally expressive, and so opening up to that, whether that's dancing or not, I don't know. But other cultures certainly do have rhythmic dance as part of celebration. And so honoring that culturally, I think, is important. This passage has been used too many times, I think, to either criticize dancing for worship or support of dancing for worship. I think either way, I don't think you can make an entire case just based on this passage. I do think the general idea here, though, is that David isn't doing something wrong here. He may have done things wrong in the past, and that's why his wife is now doing something wrong herself by criticizing him. That would be my take. Anything else you want to say to that? You look like you might want to say something to that.
No, I was just thinking, like, there was one time in worship where I could only see you out of the corner of my eye, but I thought you were raising your hands, and I was like, and I was just surprised. And then I said something to you about it later, and you're like, no. And I said, well, would you do that? And you just said, it's not how I express myself.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's necessarily true, though. I've seen Touchdown. I've seen Packers dances.
No, you haven't seen Packers dances. I haven't danced.
I've seen joyous physical expression when the Packers win a game.
Yeah, I think so.
So I don't know it's necessarily not how you express yourself. I think maybe you've just been taught, so remember my church growing up when the man sprinted around the sanctuary and you were like, what's happening?
I remember.
But it was the 90s. Yeah. And you thought that was there was no propriety in the worship.
Yeah.
But it was during a time of excited worshiping and people were dancing and maybe that's how he dances. He just sprints. It was like a running man.
I remember a professor at the seminary commenting on this and stating that even though we don't know that David did anything wrong, there is a question of whether or not what he's doing is wise. If what you do now, you can't control what everybody perceives, but if what you're doing is distracting to somebody else, from Michael's standpoint, theoretically, Michael should have also been rejoicing that that the ark was coming to Jerusalem. But if at this point all she can concern myself with is, oh my goodness, my husband, he's acting beside himself. At what point does that become worshiply?
Don't you think that's a good example?
Worship disruption.
When he says, I'm willing to look like a fool because I'm worshiping God.
It's really nuanced. I think there's a lot to take from this. I think, the question of, is it ever what I'm doing, does it draw attention away from God, is an interesting and worthwhile worship question. But the flip side of that there's very clearly some emotive, expressive joy being given in worship. I think, you can't, if you look at a group of several hundred people and the last thing that you would interpret this as in worship is the last thing you see there is joy or gratitude or expression, I think you do have to have I think there's rightfully a critique of that. And the way that I would sometimes put it is, you were mentioning other aspects of life. While everybody does express themselves emotionally a little differently, I'm more reserved than you are. You're more expressive. I'm less animated than you are, right? At the same time, when somebody wins the lottery, we assume a certain type of reaction, irrespective of what their personality is, because great news prompts great reply. And so if you have great news, seemingly there's going to be I think it's worth each of us meditating on, is the reply to the gospel that I'm expressing right now, is it like proportionate to the good news?
You're winning the lottery every time you go to public worship.
Yes.
For many reasons.
Yes.
That you get to attend public worship, that you are saved.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's a good point. I think there's, as we talk with most things, there's probably a balance on either side. And I think for me personally, my experience growing up, I think was the end on one side.
Yeah. It's really very interesting to hear, like, okay, so that's a seminary answer. Like, it's not wrong, but is it wise? Like, it's just so interesting because I feel like that is that person's opinion. Like, you're saying it's potentially unwise.
Culturally, questioning the cultural wisdom of something. Paul does this with in Corinthians and Romans. He says, like, you guys have freedom to do something, but culturally, what are people going to understand when you do this? Right? I think the answer then is the law of love. Like, is this primarily something I want, or is this primarily in the best interest of the other person? And that's just something to wrestle with. There's no clear-cut answer you're going to come down on.
Right, yeah.
So.
Just has to be applied both ways.
Yes, it has to be consistently applied both ways. What I have to be as objective as I can be about what the ditches are on the other end, and not... understand that there's two sides.
Keep it between the ditches. Yeah. That's what my mom used to say every time I would get in the car to go somewhere. When I was
between the ditches?
She'd say, keep it between the ditches and point it straight ahead.
Oh, that is rural northern Michigan. I feel like lines is probably a better target. So, all right, ready to close with prayer? All right. Heavenly Father, thank you for our time in your word here today. I'm personally thinking a lot about what it means to have the right intent of glorifying you and worshiping you, but having such a self-centered attitude that I want to do it all my own way, and I want to do it on my own terms and my own whatever. And I'm certain David had some of that, and he had to learn that he had to humble himself further. So Lord, we ask you to humble us, that we understand you are worthy of worship, and we want to worship you, but that requires us to just really empty ourselves of ourselves so that we can do it well and do it in a way that glorifies you, not in a way that just draws whatever kind of attention or lifts up our own name, but lifts up your name. It's hard, Lord. There's many ways to fall, but we ask that you give us wisdom to do it in a way that glorifies you. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks for studying with us. We will see you next time. We're going to put 2 Samuel 7 and 8 together, so we'll see you then.